We asked a question a few weeks ago, what is our greatest need? And we learned from Jesus that our greatest need is forgiveness. And then last week we learned how do we respond to that forgiveness, and we need to be like Matthew and follow Jesus. Jesus comes down from preaching the Sermon on the Mount, and everyone said he taught as one with authority. And then Matthew tells us that he showed who he was in the next two chapters. And we're going to get into that in a thing, but he said, as one who had authority, and then at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, before Jesus ascends to the Father, he said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He is sovereign, and today we're going to see what that means in the Gospel of Matthew. There's not a day that goes by that someone's asked me or emailed or texted to actually be praying for someone who is suffering. And each one of us at some point or at every point are either suffering or is very close to someone who is suffering. And you could actually say that life, in a way, life is suffering. And Jesus knows that. And it seems moment by moment, in every part of his life, Jesus is dealing with suffering. Sometimes to the point that he is physically exhausted. Sometimes he actually tells people, don't tell anyone, because he needs to stop and pray. But he's showing us something. He is compassionate and loving and tender in this next miracle we're going to see. And what's unique about this miracle is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all write about it. It's really cool. Matthew has been proving to us that Jesus is Emmanuel, that he is God with us, that Jesus is the Messiah. And Matthew is systematically proving that Jesus is not just a king, he is the King of Kings. And he's a king that we're going to see today that actually cares. And just like all the other miracles that we've seen, Jesus does them on purpose. There's a reason behind it. It's not just him displaying power. There's a reason, and I love this. Modern people, we think of miracles as suspension of the natural order. But Jesus meant it to be the restoration of the natural order. That's what Jesus does with the miracles. Think about it. The Bible tells us that God did not originally make the world to have disease and hunger and death in it. And what kind of miracles have we seen Jesus do? He feeds the hungry. Jesus healed the diseases. And today we're going to see he raises the dead. Jesus is proving something. The Bible tells us that God did not originally make the world to have disease and hunger and death in it. Jesus has come to redeem the world. Just get it. Where it's wrong, and heal the world where it's broken. And his miracles are not just proof that he has the power, but also gives us a foretaste of what that power is going to look like. Jesus' miracles are not just a challenge to our minds, but a promise to our hearts of what the future is. When Jesus is doing each of these miracles, he's showing us, he's giving a taste to something, what's going to happen. Jesus solves the power and the pain, and he'll use that to turn it around. In Revelation, it says this, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. But how do we know that Jesus can do that? How do we know that Jesus can do what it says at the end of Revelation? Who is the one who can reverse the curse? It's Jesus. I don't know if you were wondering. It's Jesus. Because he actually is going to ultimately destroy disease, pain, and death. And how he does that for us is he's proving that he can do it. He's just showing us. My mom and dad called me this morning while I was driving. They call me at the same time every year, at the time that I was born, and they sing. I'm not kidding. Exactly when I was born, the phone rings and they're singing. It's really sweet. But today, I was so thinking about this that I was and I started to kind of explain it to them, and they were just totally quiet. And I finished half the sermon driving. I was just talking. And I was like, oh, thanks. That helped me get it. And we love that. That was really... Because I was talking about what Jesus is going to do. He's showing us his power to reverse the curse of sin that's in the world. When Jesus is walking on the earth, he sees all the suffering. At one point, Jesus is broken. He knows he's going to raise Lazarus. He gets to Bethany, and he sees the ones that he loves, and they're broken, and he just cries. Now, he knows he's getting ready to stand up and raise Lazarus, and so they said, oh, look how much he loved him. But it was more than that. Jesus was actually seeing the effects that sin has in the world. And he had compassion. And Matthew is proving to us over and over again that Jesus is the one who is going to establish his kingdom. The miracles show his power. In Matthew 4, it says, Jesus went throughout all Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease. Every. And then in Matthew 9, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And then in Matthew 11, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Matthew is showing us Jesus is the King of Kings throughout the whole gospel. And he starts off in chapters 1 and 2 with his birth. His birth is, he is in the kingly line. As a matter of fact, in chapter 2, the kingmakers come, and what did they do in front of the baby Jesus? They bow down and worship. They know he's the king. And then in Matthew chapter 3, there is a herald, a proclaimer of the kingdom, John the Baptist. And he is proclaiming the king is coming. And then at the end of chapter 3, John baptizes Jesus. And when Jesus comes up, the Father speaks from heaven. And he affirms it. And then in chapter 4, he goes out into the wilderness and is tempted by Satan, and he wins because he's the king. And then in chapters 5, 6, and 7, it shows that Matthew tells us he has the ultimate doctrinal, theological, scriptural authority. And because he said, you have heard it said, but I say. And people are like, but you say? You just quoted Moses. And then you said, but I say. And he explains it more and more. And then it's chapters 8 and 9, 3 sets of 3 miracles. And all of those miracles just show us what the kingdom is ultimately going to look like. And Jesus is just proving it over and over to his end. I'm the king that has power over disease. I'm the king who has power over the demonic world. I am the king who actually has power over creation. So a hurricane breaks out, he doesn't just stop the hurricane. It actually is like it wasn't even there. It actually is calm. Just read that through Matthew 8. He doesn't just speak and it's like now the hurricane's dying down. It's over. And it's like it wasn't there. And you know what it says about the disciples? They were afraid before. Now they're afraid. Because he spoke and creation did what he said. And then he shows the religious leaders, I have the power to forgive sin. Because he says, son, your sins are forgiven. And they're like, who are you to forgive sin? He said, would it have been easier if I said, take up your mat and walk? But so the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins. He said, take up your mat and walk. Could they do that? Forgive sins or heal them? What he's proving in the healing is that he can forgive sins and he can heal. And today, he even is going to show us that he has the power over death. And so we need to remember that. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke tells us what's happening. And we have to ask ourselves the question, am I trusting Jesus? Am I trusting in his timing? And am I trusting in his power? And this is important. I need to make some room. You're like, oh yeah, you need a lot more room. So let me give you a little quick, not review because we just did the review, but I'm going to set up right now. Jesus gets off the boat and he shows an amazing amount of compassion to two people. And we know from the gospel writers that there is a multitude of people trying to get to Jesus. They've come from all around, some traveling for weeks with their sick just to see Jesus. And who are these two people? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's a ruler and a woman, and they are so different. But we see the compassion, the tenderness of Jesus. And it said, in Mark it says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. So Jesus is back in Capernaum. Remember, it's becoming disease-free, right? Israel's like this little thing that nothing like this has ever happened. I was reading this week that it wasn't until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that we actually figured out how to heal diseases. I don't know. I mean, I didn't go do a lot of research. I was just reading that going. So what Jesus is doing, nobody's ever seen before, and it's amazing. People are coming from everywhere. So just think about it. So as they're walking, Jesus sees Matthew, the tax collector. We talked about him last week, and he says, follow me. And he drops his business, literally leaves it, and starts to follow Jesus. And then the Pharisees get in this argument with Jesus about why aren't you disciples doing this? And Jesus is explaining it to him. And while Jesus, just listen, while Jesus is talking to these Pharisees and explaining to them, listen. And while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him. And that word, knelt, is actually the Greek word for homage, worship. So I want you to think about this. Mark tells us the same story. His name's Jairus. Luke actually adds, because this is such a strange thing for a synagogue official to do, Luke says, and behold, like, this is shocking. What just happened is shocking because a synagogue official would have been very, very immediately connected with all those religious leaders, all those Pharisees that are in Capernaum. He is the head of a religious establishment. They are the ones who pretty much determine what life was like in the synagogue. That's what his job would have been. What was getting taught from the synagogue, that would have been, and the religious teachers, like the Pharisees, and that's not Jairus, he wasn't that. They hated Jesus and they resented him, and they had already started to make plans to kill him. Okay, so that is going on in the religious leader's mind, and here comes an official. He's not a scribe or a rabbi. He is a synagogue official, and what does that mean? It means that there is, in each synagogue, a group of overseers or administrators, and they run synagogue life. They're the elders of the synagogue. They were the ones who cared for the scrolls. They cared for the facility. They organized the synagogue school. They had oversight responsibilities. They appointed the readers of the prayers and the rabbis who would teach. And it was a very big honor to be this job. So he was selected by the synagogue, and it was usually 3 to 7 men, depending on the size of the town, that actually ran any particular synagogue. And so he is the epitome, and he is the ruler of them. So he is like the chairman of the overseers of the synagogue. That's his job. So he is the epitome of Capernaum religious establishment. So do you see the connection here? Jesus is actually talking to some teachers of religious leaders, right? The Pharisees. Now, would this religious leader know what Jesus has been doing? Absolutely. It's a little town. I mean, a little town, like 1,500 people in the whole town. He would have known all of the miracles that Jesus was doing. And scholars believe that this was the same synagogue that when Jesus, and this tells us about this in Mark chapter 1, when Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, there was a person filled with demons, and they cried out, "Son of God," in the synagogue. And this is the guy that runs the synagogue. So he would have known this demon-possessed person and heard him want, "You are the Holy One of God." And by the way, this is amazing. The only testimony you hear about the deity of Jesus, all the way up until the crucifixion, the only ones you hear are demons. Every time demons are encountered with Jesus, they know who he is. It takes the disciples so long to figure out, and they just proclaim he is the Christ, but they know, the demons know he's the Son of God. And then when we get to the end of Matthew, the Gentile centurion says truly he was the Son of God. But other than that, all through the Gospels, demons are the ones that say it. Now, here's what's really surprising. I'm taking off my jacket. That's really surprising. Well, I know she's got to go back and sit there in a second. What's really surprising is here is this religious leader, and he is coming to where Jesus is. So he is kind of pushing through to get to where Jesus is. And why is this so surprising? Is because when he arrived to where Jesus was, I mean, he's getting through, he fell at the feet of Jesus. And when I was looking up the actual Greek word, that homage, that awe, it actually says he would have grabbed his feet. Are you guys just imagining? This is clearly out of character. If we know anything about what's going on in the first century, here is a religious leader falling down before someone that the rest of the religious establishment wants dead. He fell at his feet and worshiped Jesus. I mean, the humility, the desperation, the faith that it took to make that bold of a move. Mark says he begged Jesus, earnestly implored him, "Please, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come, lay your hands on her, and she will get well and live." Here is the patron, the ruler of the synagogue. He has great devotion for God. That's how he got the job. He's very moral. He's respected by all the people, and he's wealthy. And he is trusting Jesus. He's desperate. He sees Jesus, fell at his feet, and pleaded earnestly to him, "My little daughter's dying." She's on her deathbed. Just imagine, here's this acute, immediate need. She is literally taking her last breaths. This is how Luke describes it. This is it. She is, can't imagine. And nothing that anyone can do, nothing he could do. And he hears that Jesus is back. Jesus is off the boat, and he gets word. He's running. He's pushing through the clouds. He didn't send someone to go get Jesus. He went. There's probably a lot of other sick people that are trying to get to Jesus too. The crowds are pushing in. But he doesn't care. He knows what the other religious leaders think about Jesus. Just think about it. And he runs, and while they're standing there looking at him, here is this man, and he falls down, and he grabs the feet of Jesus, and he worships him, and he asks him. He fell at his feet and pleaded. He has faith, and he is trusting that Jesus is going to be able to do this. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will live. You know what he's telling the other leaders? While he's down there, he's looking at them going, I don't care what you think. Throw me out of the synagogue. I don't care. He can do this. So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed them. Now, Matthew chapter 9 tells us that Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. So now it's him, Jesus, and the disciples, and they're pushing through. They're going to his house. They're off. Now just thinking. They're making a path. They're in a hurry. You know, I just had the picture. It's like some kind of like first century ambulance driver, you know, like beep, beep, like things, you know, people are going ahead, pushing the crowd aside, coming through. We're on a mission. But then something happens. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give us even more detail of what happens. Just then, a woman who has been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. Now, so what happens is another person shows up in the middle of the story. And there's two people. There's this ruler and this woman. And this is amazing. Mark tells us that she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and that she had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. She is described in so much detail. There are 7 participle phrases that are used to describe the condition that she was in. She was sick, and it was chronic, and she had been bleeding for 12 years. And it was getting worse. And she lost all her money to the doctors, and most of the commentators said now she's a beggar. But she's a beggar that can't go near anyone because she's lonely, because the law says, you remember this is very serious, in Leviticus 15, Leviticus 22, Numbers 5, they tell us all the things that make us unclean. And if you read through, if you want to read those 3 chapters, I'll say them to you again in a second. Just read through them. There are so many things that make us unclean. Sometimes even touching somebody that we didn't know was unclean makes us unclean. If you have mold in your house, that would make you unclean. There's like, at some point, almost all the time, you're unclean, and then you have to go get clean. And so, according to the law, she couldn't get ceremonially clean. Do you see why Jesus is having so... This is just a picture of the reality of what sin does in our lives. And that's what Matthew's trying to point out. Just like the leprous man at the beginning of chapter 8. She's sick, she's broke, she's lonely, she's spiritually unclean. She can't go to the synagogue, she can't go to the temple, she can't touch anyone or they would be unclean. She is desperate. She's desperate, but she has faith too. And how do we know she has faith? Now, think back to Jairus. Here is a man, a Jewish leader, And Jewish leaders don't worship anyone except God. They wouldn't fall down. They would rather be executed by whoever it was. Don't you remember all the times? That's a whole nother sermon. Okay. But she has faith too. And she said to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will be healed. Okay, so she hears about Jesus. She has faith that if I could just touch, I will be healed. She's heard where he is. And she's probably pushing through the crowd. And this is like, why would she think that, though? Why would she think if I just touch him? But I mean, we know that Jesus has done some miracles where he touched the leper who was unclean and made him clean. But how would she think this? And this is really cool. I wish I had like a real one to show you, but I'll just kind of picture this in your head. She believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And it says this in Malachi chapter 4. But to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise, and healing will be on his wings. But to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise, and healing will be on his wings. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And so this is really cool. I did this a few years ago, and I told you about it, and I'm going to do it. Jesus is a rabbi. He is a teacher. He is a Jewish man, and there was very specific rules on what they would wear. So Jesus would have had some kind of shawl on that would have draped over his body. And then you can read about this in Numbers 15, and it tells them exactly how they're supposed to wear it. And then you've probably seen it if you ever saw a like Orthodox Jewish person, and they have the little tassels on their clothes, and they have 4 of them. And it's very specific in Numbers 15 what that means. And it is a constant reminder that you are separate from the rest of the world. You are a Jew. And then each one of those tassels that hang down, they would be reminded every time they got dressed, I'm one of God's people. And then they were tied in a very specific way, representing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is the Torah. And they would wrap their fingers around it. And they would say this, Torah is my life. Torah is, and they would wrap it, the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, well, if you don't know, okay. And so that was a constant reminder. So they always have these garments on that are a constant reminder of God and his word, and that they were part of that, and they were part of that community. And it says this, listen, this is cool. The edges are called a kanaf. Say kanaf. Kanaf. And do you know what kanaf means? It's actually the same word used as wing on a bird, on a wing. And so he would have had this, had been hanging down. The edge would have been a kanaf, and it said the Messiah would have healing in his wings. Right? Okay. She is trusting, she is believing, she is placing her faith that what she's heard, that Jesus is the Messiah. And if I could touch his wing, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. In the King James, it says, freed from the plague. She's healed. Oh, this is so cool. And this Greek word, healed, isn't the normal Greek word that we use for healed. It's actually the Greek word we used for salvation. I know. So you're looking it up, and you're like, oh, healed, but it's more than that. She is actually made whole. Now think of the power of Jesus. Not only does it stop, but it's like it wasn't there. It's complete healing. Like it'll be at the end of Revelation. There'll be no more disease. No. She trusted Jesus. And verse 30, at once Jesus realized power went out of him. And he turned around and he said, who touched my clothes? Now the disciples are like, duh, like, there are thousands of people. And they're all trying to talk to you. Remember, we got the ambulance going. They're like, and Jesus stops. Now remember, there's Jairus, and he's like, okay, well, what's happening? Like, all he hears is Jesus say, who touched me? And he's probably thinking, please, let's keep moving. Like, I got you to come. The actual word, Jesus is like, who touched me? Because he realized power, dunamis, went from him. If we're going to trust Jesus, we need to trust his timing. You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. What is Jesus doing? They're probably thinking, there's a little girl dying, and now you have stopped the ambulance and got out, and you're walking around looking for something. Now, he has faith that Jesus is going to be able to heal her. But is Jesus is really pushing the bounds of, you're going to have to trust me, to him. Then the woman, knowing what happened to her, came and fell at his feet, same word, and told him the whole truth. When she realized that not only did it stop, but that she was clean, but that she was whole. But she at that moment knew that Jesus was the Messiah. And I'm saved. Now, you have to think for a minute on this timing thing, because Jesus is going to really test it out. So they're driving along, right? We're on the way to this, immediate need. And now Jesus has stopped and gotten out. That's a metaphor, right? There's no cars yet. I don't know if y'all knew that. Cars won't be invented for a long time. Jesus stops. And I can't even imagine how he must be feeling. But Jesus doesn't care about our timing. And he is so compassionate and merciful. And he stops and he listens to this woman's whole story. Do you know how big of a huge deal that is in the first century? What Jesus just did? First off, a woman touched him, and an unclean woman at that. And Jesus is breaking all kind of their traditional rules. And he is looking at her, and she's touching him, and she's worshiping him. And Jesus doesn't say, don't worship me. He doesn't tell Jairus that either. Do you notice that? The Pharisees are probably really angry that these people are now worshiping Jesus, and he's accepting the worship, saying he is what? Worthy of worship. He's God. He is the King of Kings. Okay, this is like so awesome. Like there's this kid, okay, go into the emergency room. You go into the emergency room, and your daughter is like, it's like beep, like it's like gonna happen any minute now. And then all of a sudden your doctor walks away, and he starts talking to this woman who obviously has a problem, but she's had this problem for a long time. And then he starts charting out her life. You know what we call that? A lawsuit. That's what you call that, right? Because here is the immediate need, and you're talking to somebody that this has been going on, and then we find out later, for 12 years. Okay. Meet this need, we can come back to this problem another day. But Jesus, he's teaching everybody something. One commentator called this Jesus' malpractice. And after Jesus hears her whole story, Mark tells us, he says this, daughter, this is the only time Jesus uses that word for anyone. Is this word here. Daughter, your faith has healed you. But the Greek word is saved. Go in peace and be freed. I think we know best that if Jesus has the power to do something, I know when he should do it. So we know we don't have that kind of power, but we know that Jesus does. But can we also trust in his timing? Because this is the worst news ever. In verse 35, this is in chapter 5 of Mark. While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house to Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? You think he was thinking, if we would have kept going, we were just 3 houses away, and Jesus stopped and he's dealing with this woman? This is still pretty awesome because he's still trusting Jesus. My daughter's just died. But come and put your hand on her and she will live. He's still going to trust in Jesus' power. Am I trusting in Jesus' power? I mean, do we ask ourselves that? Am I trusting in his power? So Jesus ignored what they said, and he told the synagogue ruler, don't be afraid. Believe. Trust me, Jesus is saying. And he says, okay, if you come and touch her, she'll be alive. And I know that we don't understand sometimes, most of the time, what Jesus is doing. But he's saying, I love you, I know what's best for you, and I know what I'm doing. When did Jesus tell the disciples in the storm? He told them, what did he tell them? He told them, don't be afraid. But they were in the boat in a hurricane. There was actually something to be afraid of. If you were going to be afraid ever, being in a hurricane, you need to be afraid. Being in a hurricane in the water, that would be a time to be afraid. And Jesus is saying, don't be afraid. Jesus is teaching not only this amazing respect for women that wasn't happening in the first century, he's actually telling us, I'm not on your time. As a matter of fact, the delay in Jesus doing this is actually going to give a greater faith both to this woman and to Jairus and to his daughter. Listen, one commentator said, okay. I just looked at the clock and looked down and went, how many pages we got? You will always both give and get from Jesus far more than you bargain for when you go to him for something. Whenever you go to Jesus for something, you will always get and give more than you bargained for to get and give. The deal never works out like you think or expect. Look at Jairus, okay, right? He came to Jesus to get a fever cured. And he's going to get more for his faith in Jesus than that. He's actually going to see a resurrection. Now imagine for the rest of his life, is he going to care what the Pharisees say? No. Imagine the little girl. One commentator said that he believed that Jairus and the daughter and this woman would have been among the 500 who saw Jesus after his resurrection. That was just a speculation, but It makes sense because of where they're at. He came thinking, do I have enough to trust Jesus that my daughter won't die? But he got so much more because he's trusting Jesus that he's going to be able to raise her. The great physician, Jesus looks right into his eyes and says, trust me. Now, what does this woman want? I think she wanted to touch and run, right? She wanted to get the healing and go. Like, I don't want anybody paying attention to me. Like, just let me have this. And Jesus is calling her out and making her make a profession, making her say what happened in front of all those people. And the people all probably knew who she was, and they probably did just like with the leprous man. They all stepped back, right? Because if I touch her, just like if I touch her, I'm going to be unclean. She wanted to go, I'm better out here. And Jesus is like, no. Jesus forces her to go public. She was considered cursed. She was physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually spent. And for her to touch a rabbi in public was a sin, but he made her go public. She needs this. This is far more than she wanted to give. She is getting to get so much more than she wanted to get. She's not superstitious. I mean, she's a little stitious, but no, she's not superstitious. She thinks the touch is going to heal her, and Jesus' whole point is getting her out and said, oh, no. It's faith that has saved you. You believed I was the Messiah, and you are right. And so now imagine her faith from that point on. Yes, okay, good, thank you. The delay, what God's doing, not doing it on our time, is going to be far greater than what we could ever think or even imagine. Because it seems like in my life, Jesus, you're not really getting this timing thing down, right? I need healing now. I need a job now. I want a relationship like this now. I've been praying for my grandson to know. Okay, Jesus is like, I've got it. He is compassionate and kind, and he is powerful. So we need to trust his timing. Trust Jesus. Trust his word. The Bible says he is working everything out for our good. And I know that when I look at my own life and in the impatience and self-righteousness, I think that I know better of what should happen than Jesus does. I look at Jesus and say, you're this eternal Son of God who lived for all eternity, created the universe. Why would you know better than what should happen in my life? Because Jesus knows all the facts. I can't know them all. I feel like I do. We feel like, why isn't everything going exactly the way that I planned? And the answer is, we're not God. Self-righteousness needs to be knocked out of our hearts. One professor said, if it looks like I'm doing something that makes no sense, talk about Jesus. If it looks like I'm doing something that makes no sense, just figure that I have some facts you don't have. So wherever you're at in your life right now, and you know what the timing should be on what you think God should do, we just need to stop and realize, okay, I don't have all of the information. It's hard, and I know that we need to pray to get help. Jesus got to the house, and all the people are there crying. And when Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house, and saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes, he said, go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. And after the crowd had been put outside, he went and took her by the hand, and she got up. It says after he put them all out, he took the child's mother and father and the disciples who were with him, and they went into where the child was. And then in Mark it says he took her by the hand, and he said this, Talitha kum. And as I was looking it up, it's the most tender thing that Jesus does with this little girl. It's translated, we say, little girl, I say to you, get up. But in Aramaic, it's actually a term of endearment. It would be more like, sweetheart, it's time to get up. And immediately, her spirit came back into her. Okay. What is he showing us? I am that powerful. This is what it's going to be. This is what my kingdom will. All these things that Jesus is doing in this one little area in the world. He knows there's suffering everywhere, but he's proving, I'm going to set up my kingdom. Sweetheart, get up. We can trust his timing because he is compassionate and powerful. And what is Jesus teaching us? How could he heal the woman? How could he make her clean again? By taking her and all of our uncleanness on the cross. How could he raise the little girl from the dead? Because he knew what he was saying. I'm going to take your death. That's what he's saying to us, beloved. He's telling us he sees all of the suffering, how it's not supposed to be, and he is taking it on himself. They were looking for the Messiah for right then to come and establish the kingdom. And he will. But something needed to happen first. Justice had to be done for the evil that is in the world and the suffering. And each thing that Jesus did was a reminder that he was going to take that suffering and pay that penalty. So why should we trust Jesus? Why should we trust his timing? Because he loved us enough to come and do that. Let's pray. Father, can we thank you? I am so sorry of all those times that I'm not trusting you. Oh, forgive me. Not trusting your purpose or your timing, but you are all powerful. And Father, we need to be made whole. And I pray for anyone in here that right now wants to be whole, wants to be healed, wants to ultimately be saved and know that in your kingdom. Open our eyes. If we could just touch his wing, we could be healed. Amen.